A construction company has found itself at the center of a scandal after an unattended lift carried 3 children up the 18th floor, leaving them trapped in the cold and high winds. The parents accused the developer of negligence, while he insisted that the parents were responsible. The court ruled in favor of the victims, ordering the company to pay $200,000 in compensation, but its representatives hint at an appeal. Will this case become a precedent for changes in safety regulations? Chapter 1. Opening of the case. The Cook County courtroom was filled with the muffled hum of conversation. At large wooden tables covered with dark varnish, both sides of the process were already seated. The lawyers checked the documents, looking suspiciously at each other. The plaintiff clenched her hands nervously, and the defendant's representative looked cold-blooded, as if this process was a routine matter for him. High windows let in daylight, which dissolved in the light dust floating in the air. A sense of tension hung in the spacious hall filled with anticipation. Injured relatives, journalists, and several interested citizens filled the audience. Some whispered, trying to understand the essence of the matter. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hall opened, and a judge entered the room. Elizabeth Crawford, a tall woman with determined features and piercing gray eyes. Her black robe fell in waves to the floor, and she held a file folder in her hand. Her gait was confident, her gaze was cold and focused. She quickly looked around the hall and motioned to the secretary. "Get up. The trial is coming," announced the bailiff loudly. All present stood up. The judge sat down at a massive table, opened a briefcase, and began without delay. The case is being heard: Jessica Williams versus Urban Developments Construction Company. The plaintiff claims that her son was injured due to the negligence of the defendant. The defendant denies responsibility, believing that the child's safety is the responsibility of the parents. Crawford paused, giving the audience time to absorb the meaning of her words, and looked at the plaintiff. "Miss Williams, do you confirm your requirements?" Jessica, a young woman with short dark hair, swallowed nervously and nodded decisively. "Yes, Your Honor." "Is your lawyer ready to present the case?" Mark Blake, a middle-aged man in a dark gray suit, cocked his head confidently. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned her gaze to the defendant's lawyer. "Mr. Ballard, is your side ready?" Alex Ballard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with impeccably combed hair, smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. We are ready to prove that the responsibility lies with the parents of the affected children." The judge raised her eyebrows slightly, as if she was already familiar with such arguments. "Good. Let's start with the speeches of the parties. Mr. Blake, you have the floor." The hall froze in anticipation. The trial began. Chapter 2. Details of the incident. The plaintiff's attorney, Mark Blake, rose from his seat, looked around the judge and the jury, and in a calm but confident voice began. "Your Honor, Honorable Court, this case is not just about legal responsibility. It is about trust. Trust in those who are responsible for security in our cities, in our districts, near our homes. Trust what a construction company, Urban Developments, neglected." He paused, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a few documents. "Let's go back 2 months, August 12th, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was an ordinary summer day. 7-year-old Lucas Williams and his friends were playing in the playground outside their home, a place their parents thought was safe. Jessica Williams, sitting next to her, tightly clasped her hands as if reliving the day. For several weeks before that, in the residential complex, Urban Heights, the facade was being repaired. Company Urban Developments used a construction lift for high-altitude work. Their workers finished their shift that day, but instead of removing the equipment, or at least securing it, they simply left it unattended. Mark Blake walked slowly to the evidence table, picked up a photo taken by the police that day, and held it up to the judge. This is what the children saw. A large, unprotected metal platform hanging in the lower position is attractive and accessible to inquisitive toddlers. Your Honor, can 7-year-olds be blamed for wanting to investigate it? Is this the responsibility of those who should ensure the safety of this site? He placed the photo on the table and paused once more, allowing the judge to consider the details. The children climbed inside. Someone accidentally pressed the button. and suddenly the platform began to rise. Not by a meter, not by two. She stopped only at the level 18th floor. Imagine the fear of 7-year-old children who found themselves at such a height, with no way to get out. There were muffled sighs in the hall. Several members of the jury became visibly distressed as they imagined this dire situation. But that's not all. On that day, bad weather started. Strong wind, cold rain with snow. The children shouted for help, but there was no one in the yard. Only a random passerby, an elderly woman, heard their screams and called rescuers. Blake turned back to his desk and focused his gaze on the judge. Your Honor, my question is simple. Would it be possible if urban developments fulfilled her duties? Could this situation have happened if someone had taken proper security? I claim not, and I will prove it in the course of this process. Chapter 3. Position of the defendant. As soon as the plaintiff's attorney, Mark Blake, took his seat, the defendant's attorney, Alex Ballard, slowly stood up. His movements were calm, confident. He took a step forward and met Judge Crawford's gaze, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Your Honor, I respect the emotional speech of my colleague, but let me remind you that we have gathered here to establish facts, not to create dramatic pictures. Ballard paused, letting his words settle in the minds of those present, and continued. We all agree that this situation is tragic. But the main question we have to solve today is, who is responsible? My client, Urban Developments, recognizes that construction is an area of increased danger, and that is why appropriate safety measures have been taken. The territory where the works were carried out was clearly fenced with signal tapes, were installed warning signs. Workers repeatedly saw how children were playing nearby, and even made remarks to the residents about the danger. Does this mean that is the company responsible for the careless behavior of children? Ballard walked over to the evidence table and picked up one of the documents. It was a copy of the act drawn up after the incident. Here is the police report. Here it is clearly stated that the repair area was properly marked. Moreover, our employees did not leave the equipment in an active state. We will submit expert testimony to explain that the lift could not have activated itself. That is, children broke mechanism or at least interfered with its operation. Judge Crawford listened intently, leaning back in her chair. She raised her eyebrows and asked, "So you want to say that 7-year-old children are responsible for starting a construction lift?" Your Honor, Ballard paused and looked at the jury. We do not deny that this was an accident. But should company be responsible for the actions of children who deliberately entered the construction site? Isn't this situation a consequence insufficient parental supervision? Shouldn't they have taught their children about safety? Several members of the jury exchanged glances. There was a heavy silence in the courtroom. Ballard made the final point. We have witnesses, we have evidence, and we will prove that the responsibility is not on the construction company, but on the human factor on the parents who left the children unattended. Chapter 4. Evidence and Examinations. Judge Crawford looked from the defendant's attorney to Mark Blake. You have the opportunity to present evidence, Mr. Blake. The plaintiff's lawyer stood up slowly, straightening his shoulders. He opened the briefcase, took out several documents, and said in a confident voice, Your Honor, jurors, we are talking about a fact that cannot be denied. Negligence urban developments led to serious consequences. To prove this, we provide 3 key proofs. Blake motioned to his assistant, who handed him a large sheet of photos of the scene. Here is the first proof. Photos of the construction site taken by the police an hour after the incident. You can see that there were no signs prohibiting access to the equipment. The area was partially fenced off with tapes, but they were lying on the ground because of the wind. He showed the pictures to the judge and then to the jury, watching their reactions. Some of them looked intently at the image, others exchanged quick glances. The second piece of evidence, continued Blake, is opinion of an independent expert on construction safety who examined the hoist mechanism after the incident. He pulled out a printed document and pointed to one of the pages. Here it is stated that the mechanism was malfunctioning before the kids got inside. The braking system was supposed to be automatically locked when the job was done, but it didn't. Moreover, Miss Crawford, the expert, points out that even if the kids didn't push any buttons, the lift could go up on its own at any time due to a system failure. The judge nodded, accepting the document. Ballard, the defendant's attorney, shrugged his shoulders. Your Honor, allow me to point out that this conclusion is only one of the opinions. Our expert will provide other facts that can prove that it happened because of reckless actions of children. Blake tilted his head. Of course. But before we get to your expert, let me provide one more piece of evidence. He produced a copy of the medical report and turned to the jury. Medical report. 3 children spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Lucas Williams has first-degree frostbite, his friend Tommy Anderson has a severe form of pneumonia, and Ryan Brooks is still undergoing psychological rehabilitation. All these injuries are a direct consequence of what they are stuck at the height of the 18th floor in the cold and bad weather. The jurors looked at each other again, discomfort on their faces. Judge Crawford slowly placed the documents on the table and turned her gaze to the defendant. Mr. Ballard, do you have any evidence that contradicts these facts? A tense silence reigned in the hall. It is time for the defendant to defend his position. Chapter 5. Judgment of the Court. There was tense silence in the courtroom. Judge Crawford turned her gaze from the lawyers to the jury. She felt that everyone present, holding their breath, was waiting for the final word. The verdict was to be a watershed moment not only for the Williams family, but for all construction companies that neglect safety. The judge slowly picked up the decision sheet and read it before saying, "The court, after considering all the evidence, hearing the testimony of the parties, and taking into account the conclusions of the experts, makes the following decision." Jessica Williams, sitting in her seat, gripped the arm of the chair tightly. Alex Ballard, the defendant's attorney, crossed his arms over his chest, remaining outwardly calm. Mark Blake, representing the plaintiff, leaned forward, ready to announce the verdict. The judge paused, then continued. Defendant, a construction company, Urban Developments, found guilty of negligence and violation of safety regulations, which directly caused harm to the health of 3 minor children. There was a muffled hum in the hall. Some of those present looked at each other, but the judge raised her hand, demanding silence. The court decides that the plaintiff, Jessica Williams, is entitled to $200,000 in punitive damages. The defendant is obliged to pay the specified amount in full. A relieved smile flashed across Jessica's face, though there were still tears of tension in her eyes. She glanced quickly at the lawyer, who nodded in support. Judge Crawford did not stop. Regarding the counterclaim Urban Developments for damages in the amount of $18,000, he deviates due to the lack of sufficient evidence that the damage was caused by the children's actions. Alex Ballard remained unmoved, though his fingers were clenched into a fist. It was a losing battle. The judge looked at both sides and concluded. In addition, in connection with the violation of safety equipment, the court transfers the case materials for further consideration by state regulatory bodies. Urban Developments may face additional sanctions. She tapped with a hammer. The court declares the case closed. The hall was filled with movement. Someone stood up. Lawyers exchanged views. Journalists quickly recorded the main points of the verdict. Mark Blake shook hands with Jessica Williams. "You did, Miss Williams. This is justice." She sighed deeply, looking towards the exit. It was not so important to her how much money was awarded. The main thing was that she proved herself right. And if this case forces other companies to be more responsible about safety, so the struggle was not in vain. Chapter 6. Response of the parties. As soon as Judge Crawford struck her gavel, officially closing the case, the courtroom fell into a tense silence that was quickly replaced by loud whispers and movement. People rose from their seats, journalists rushed to write down comments, and lawyers exchanged reserved glances. Although the decision had been made, tension was still in the air. Jessica Williams, who had been sitting almost motionless all this time, was finally able to exhale. She quickly ran her palm over her eyes, wiping away the tears of relief. Mark Blake, her lawyer, squeezed her shoulder in support. "You did it, Miss Williams. he said quietly so as not to attract attention. "You not only won the case, but also sent an important signal. Companies can no longer leave such situations without consequences." Jessica nodded but didn't answer. Her gaze settled on Alex Ballard, who was gathering his papers. She felt no triumph, no gloating, only exhaustion. Ballard, the defendant's attorney, looked tense but tried to keep his cool. He quickly crossed the hall and approached the company representative Urban Developments, who was waiting at the exit. He looked displeased, his lips pressed into a thin line. They exchanged brief words, after which Ballard, without even looking in the plaintiff's direction, left the courtroom. Journalists have already begun to gather at the door, preparing questions. One of them, a man in a dark suit with a recorder in hand, approached Blake. "Mr. Blake, what do you say about this decision? Do you think this trial will set a precedent for future construction site safety cases?" The lawyer smiled, but his answer was clear and professional. "This decision confirms that companies are responsible for the safety of their work areas, especially if they are located near residential complexes. This is an important signal for all developers." Jessica, at this time, took a few steps towards the exit, trying to avoid the cameras. She did not need fame. She wanted to return to her son, who was waiting for her at home. On the way out, she heard one of the representatives, Urban Developments, angrily said to his colleague, "This is not the end. We will still think about the appeal." She stopped, but did not turn around. Instead, she just took a deep breath, knowing that regardless of whether there was an appeal, she had already won today. Her son got justice. And what do you think? Was the judge's verdict fair? Write your thoughts in the comments below the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazier thing.